screen or at the top, or it might even be at the side, depending what you're watching on. Just tell us where you're watching from, because it looks like there's people from all over the UK and further afield. So thank you very much for coming along. I'm just going to really briefly talk through a few housekeeping things, and then I'm going to pass on to Norma to introduce Mike, who is our very exciting guest speaker for this evening. This evening's session is being recorded. Everybody who is on here this evening will get a link so that you can watch this up to 2 weeks later. And I appreciate this. There's some people, you might know some people who would have liked to have come along and listened into this. We're restricted a little bit with numbers on the Zoom. So if they would like to watch it, then if they can get in touch, we can get them a link to the recording as well. There are two. Although this is a webinar, it is absolutely interactive. So although you can't see yourself on the screen, you can interact through the chat with each other and to a certain extent with us, but it's very difficult to follow lots of chat going on. So if you've got a question, please put it in the Q&A. Please also just bear with us. We've been sent through quite a lot of questions from Mike already, and we've collated those, and that's what we're going to start this evening's session off with. But as we go through, either myself or Norma will be monitoring the Q&A, and where it's relevant to what's being talked about at the time, we'll try and include those as well. There's no way we're going to get through all of the questions that have been asked. There've been so much, so thank you very much for those. Also, tonight's webinar is the registration fee that you paid, the £3, is being donated to Surf Life Saving UK. Surf Life Saving GB, I should say, which is the national governing body for Surf Life Saving in the UK, and they manage and support lots and lots of clubs up and down the country and provide volunteer lifeguarding services and opportunities to learn water safety for youth. So really, really pleased that Mike has chosen that charity to raise the money for. That's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Steve. So for those of you who don't know, I'm Norma MacLeod, and I run an outdoor sea swimming business predominantly in the Outer Hebrides. So we have got obviously a huge interest in cold water here. It's literally cold water in the UK anyway. So Mike has very kindly been involved in, this is his third webinar with us now. And we just never seem to have enough time to ask all the questions, but we're going to present as many as we can of your questions tonight. And if you don't know Mike Tipton, he is a professor of human and applied physiology at the University of Portsmouth in the Extreme Environments Lab. He has got a huge bio, so I've picked out some of the best bits, I think, but there's so much. He's a trustee and director of Surf Life Saving GB, which is why he's chosen this charity as well, and it's a really good, worthwhile cause. He's a council member of the RNLI. He received an MBE for services to physiological research in extreme environments. But some of you might know him, you might have seen him on the TV. There's maybe been adverts or campaigns. You might have heard of the Float to Live campaign, which is a drowning prevention campaign. And Mike was involved in the research which led to those simple techniques to save a life. So Mike, if you've got your mic on there, I would like to introduce you to the rest of the participants tonight, and we can get going on some questions with you. We do have a format tonight, and we're sort of going to go through pre-swim activity, and then during the swim, post-swim, and then Mike has got a couple of things he wants to share with people, but we will take your questions throughout. So Steve, were you wanting to start off first with questions to Mike?
Yes, I can do.
I can if you're not ready.
Yeah, no, I was actually, Norma, it's all right. Do you mind doing the pre ones, and I'll do the in water ones? That's what I've got on my screen here, if that's okay. Yeah,
no bother. So Mike, are we your mic all ready? Is it? Yeah.
Hope so.
Yeah.
If you heard that, it is. Thank you for inviting me, and it's lovely to be with you guys again and everybody online.
Yeah, it's amazing that you keep coming back to do these things, but there's always questions. So thank you again. So I'm going to start with pre-swim activity. There's been some questions coming in, and there's been a lot of similar questions, so we've had to sort of put them together just to save a bit of time. And one of the questions is always, what's the safest way to enter cold water, and why does it take people longer to acclimatise than others? Mike, that one's from Shannon.
Yeah, okay, so I mean, you know the answer to that question, those of you who go swimming. The safest way to enter is slowly. The major problem of going into cold water is the cold shock response. We used to think it was hypothermia, but then we started finding out from laboratory studies, anecdotal accounts, and the statistics that certainly in the UK in cold water, about 60% of the deaths occur in the first minute or two of immersion. And we called that response, that uncontrollable hyperventilation, sudden increase in the workload of the heart, we called it the cold shock response, not because of the medical definition of shock, but because it's just a shocking experience. And that the size of that response is directly proportional to the number of cold receptors that you stimulate, because it's initiated by the cold receptors just beneath the surface of the skin, about 0.18 millimeters below the surface of the skin. And the more of those receptors that you stimulate, and the faster they're stimulated, the bigger the dynamic response from them that drives the cold shock response. Now, so the more you cover up and the slower you go in, it might seem a bit more tortuous to go in slowly, but you will get a smaller response. You will have a lower strain placed on the heart, the cardiovascular system, and the respiratory system. And that response, if you get it, lasts about a minute or 90 seconds. And it's just that simple fact of the adaptation of the cold receptors that, as you say, underpins the RNLI and now other agencies, Coast Guard, RLSS, multi-agency advice to float first, stay still when you get in the water until you regain control of your breathing.
And see those receptors that you're talking about, is there anywhere on your body where you might feel it more that we should be aware of?
Yeah, it's worth noting actually that it's a really topical area, because the guys who described how those receptors work got the Nobel Prize for physiology or medicine this time round. So, we're in an interesting scientific area as well. Yes, there are different densities of those responses, of those receptors. They particularly on the hands, the face, a smaller number on the large surfaces of the back and the chest. But the ones in the face are really interesting because they not only initiate the cold shock response, they also initiate a response called the diving response, which diving mammals have, that enables them to go under the water for prolonged periods. And what that does, that diving response, it slows the heart rate, it redistributes blood flow around the body, but it doesn't allow blood pressure to go up, and it helps breath holding. So the cold shock response and the diving response are absolutely diametrically opposed. And the problem is, we know that if you initiate both at the same time, it's a very good way of inducing cardiac dysrhythmia and arrhythmia. So if you really want to avoid having a cardiac arrhythmia or a dysrhythmia going into cold water, then do avoid putting your face in the water, holding your breath, extending your breath hold. Actually, just to see, this is such a topical area. Just this evening, I was watching BBC on the One Show, Ronan Keating sitting in an ice bath and telling everybody not to put their face in it and hold their breath. So exactly the same advice coming from a pop singer as me. That's probably where the similarity ends.
It's probably come from a lot of your research though, Mike. Well,
yeah, possibly. And on the other channel, there was Rick Stein swimming in. On the other channel, there was Rick Stein swimming in a 10-degree pool in Bude. So yeah, it's a big topic at the moment.
It is, and Wim Hof was on the TV this morning as well, so that's another area. Yeah, because I do see swimmers going in as an open water coach. I see different types of swimmers going in, and some swimmers go in with their hands up, and they always keep their hands out of the water. I see people doing that. We try and teach them to get their hands in because we knew about those receptors and splash the face. And so for those of the people who are here tonight and they're quite new to it, if you're wanting to sort of get used to that, acclimatize in that moment, then it's probably best to get your hands in. Would you agree, Mike?
Yeah, and you can splash the surface of the body before you get in. I mean, what you're trying to do is the size of that dynamic response from those receptors is, as I say, the more receptors you're stimulating at the same time, and the bigger the temperature change. Once the temperature change of the skin gets above about 25 degrees C per minute, then you're going to start getting that response. So yeah, enter slowly, just pre-acclimatize a bit with splashing some water on, and try and keep control of your breathing.
Yeah, it's interesting, and everybody is different. That's it. Some people are kind of acclimatized. They seem to acclimatize quicker, but there's lots of different factors at play. Is there anything you can think about that's different between people? How someone can go in and not be breathless? They don't get that cold shock response.
Yeah, I mean, there is just a genetic difference between people and between the extent to which that sudden cooling of the skin, that afferent input going into the center of the body, drives breathing and heart rate. So there's there's individual variability in all human responses.
Yeah.
We can take people who have never been in cold water and we can ask them to hold their breath, and some people can hold their breath for less than a second. You don't even see them holding their breath when they're immersed in cold water. And then you've got the half man, half Weddell seal who can hold their breath for 2 minutes.
Yeah.
And I mean, we can explain some of the variation in terms of the fitter you are, the smaller your cold shock response, because it changes the balance between the sympathetic nervous system drive that initiates the cold shock response and the parasympathetic, which slows everything down. So, you know, that balance in that autonomic nervous system changes the size of the response. The fitter you are, if you've got any previous cold exposure, you can habituate to cold. That cold shock response, we know you can halve in around about 6 3-minute immersions. You can almost do it in a day. We've done it in a day with people that we've been looking at for cold immersion for depression, for example, or just demonstrating how quickly you can do it. So yeah, now there's enormous natural individual variation, then supplemented by, you know, what people have done.
Yeah, that is really interesting, actually, that 6 immersions. I think Steve was wanting to ask something about that, were you?
Yeah, just, well, not specifically about that, Mike, but Paul Platt's come on and just asked a question which is really relevant, I think, and he's kind of referring to the Line Bay incident, the tragedy quite a few years ago now that involved children and some teachers. But he's asking, is there a difference between adults and children in general in terms of how they adapt to cold water? I guess in the acute, even the short term.
Yeah, no, we've done only one study. There's not very much work being done for obvious ethical reasons. We did one study on the British English Channel swim team, who were a group of children around about 11 or 12 years old, who certainly in terms of the cold shock response seemed to show roughly the same cold shock response and roughly the same adaptation or habituation with repeated exposure. If you want to look at the papers, I can obviously link you to them, but the first author on those papers was Flora Bird. Now, of course, it's a different kettle of fish when you start talking about longer term immersions, because children cool much more quickly than adults because they're smaller, therefore they have a higher surface area to mass ratio, a smaller mass to retain the heat in, but a big surface area to lose it from. So they're much more like radiators. So yes, but in terms of that initial response, not that much different. The thing that always amazes people when they go to the beach and they see children playing in water that they wouldn't go anywhere near is they think the children are less sensitive to the cold. It's not so much that, it's just the children are so excited and distracted by it that they don't actually have the same response to it as we would.
It's like that. There's a thing on the TV the other day with Billy Connolly reflecting on his childhood and being put in some knitted swim shorts and told to get in the North Coast.
Well, if there's knitted from wool, that's good, because as wool gets wet, it gives off heat.
Becomes somewhat bigger apparently as well.
yeah, and falls off. Yeah.
I know that we were going to cover sort of health topics, but seeing as we're talking about sort of cold water shock, Gary has asked a question: how or does a combination of cold water shock and hydrostatic squeeze sometimes cause heart attacks in otherwise fit people?
Yeah, all these experiments we do are mostly in young, fit, healthy individuals, and roughly 1 to 3% of those immersions, you will see some form of arrhythmia, even in young, fit, healthy individuals, because you are essentially vasoconstricting. You're shutting down blood flow to the skin, so that gets sent centrally, and at the same time you're turning up the pump, the heart rate goes up, the cardiac output goes up. So you're putting the system under quite a lot of pressure. You're also hyperventilating. So you've got lots of biochemical changes going on. You've got lots of lung reflexes going on. Somebody referred to the Herring-Brewer reflex there. You've shifted to a higher lung volume because the typical response is to go a 2 or 3 litre breath in and then to hyperventilate at the top of your lung. At the same time, if you're getting any water splashed onto the face, you're starting to initiate that diving response that's trying to slow the heart. So the heart gets very confused. So even in young, fit, healthy individuals, you'll see 1 to 3 in 100 immersions will show you a significant arrhythmia. If you add a bit of face wetting to that and breath holding, that goes up to 63 to 83 immersions out of 100. I mean, it's a very reproducible way of confusing the heart and causing an arrhythmia or a dysrhythmia. And we've called it autonomic conflict because it's a conflict between the 2 branches of your autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic one that's trying to drive heart rate and cardiac output up, which is the cold shock response, and the parasympathetic that's trying to slow the heart and decrease the strength of contraction, which is the diving response. But once those 2 are initiated, and actually immersion is one of the few areas where you can do that. Normally that response, if one goes up, one goes down, but with cold water immersion and breath holding and adding some water splashing onto the face, you've got a very significant chance of stimulating both sides of that system. The other interesting thing is that you can stimulate both branches at the same time of the autonomic nervous system if you get angry. Now I mentioned that. I mentioned that for a couple of reasons, is that those people who are involved in open water mass participation events where, and like me, you know, you do a triathlon and you're somewhere like Nice and they say go, and there's like thousands of people enter the water at the same time, people lose their temper. And the most deaths in triathlon occur in the swim, and they tend to occur in the first 400 meters. And these are people who have trained and are not dying when they're training, but when they're actually doing the event, they've got a combination of cold shock, they've got autonomic conflict, they're getting angry, they're having to extend their breath hold because you turn to breathe and you've got somebody's foot in your face with a plume of water. So you know it's more than just passing interest. That you should try and avoid getting angry in those situations.
Yeah. So practice your starts in triathlon. Don't just sign up to a triathlon and go for it, because I've done them and I know what it's like to be swam over. And yeah, you do get.
And if you've got any responsibility for organizing these events, make sure that you don't have situations where people end up getting congested. So have waves, have a long straight before you do a turn. You know, it's those periods of congestion where you're absolutely creating the perfect situation for cardiac arrhythmias. Yeah,
that's really interesting.
Mike, during the registration, we had quite a lot of different people ask questions around about the time we are now. When should I get out of the water? And I know in a previous webinar you were talking to you saying that maybe the feeling to get out of the water isn't necessarily the most accurate gauge to decide when to get out of cold water. Could you tell us a bit more about that and what sort of things people can do when they're starting to go in skins or in wetsuits in terms of how long they should stay in? And we've heard lots of things about, you know, you should maybe 1 minute per degree and things like that. What's your thoughts on that?
Okay, so I mean, let's preface this with, I mean, we probably won't tonight. People can watch the recordings of previous ones of these webinars and see the analysis of all the potential benefits of open water swimming, you know, the pros and cons, and I can give some literature there where people can read up on that. But I mean, it's a poorly researched area in terms of the benefits of open water swimming. It's largely anecdotal, but it's strong anecdotal, because there's hardly anybody you'll talk to who doesn't say that it's fantastic and does them good for whatever reason. But what little evidence, what it comes down to is you then say, okay, well, what's the dose of cold that you need? What is it about open water swimming that's good for you? And it could be anything. It could be floating, it could be exercise, it could be being in a nice environment, it could be meeting people, it could be going for a hot chocolate and a cake afterwards, it could be all kinds of things. But even if it's just the cold, what dose of cold do you need? And what little evidence there is Scientists use the word hypothesize. Most other people use the word guess, but it sounds a bit posher to say hypothesize. So I would hypothesize that actually quite a lot of the beneficial effects of open water swimming, cold water swimming, come from that cold shock response. So although it's a big killer in that it, puts a strain on the heart, you lose control of your breathing, on the other side of the coin, it's releasing the stress hormones. It's, there's some vagal activity going on. There's all kinds of things going on that are potentially beneficial in terms of being anti-inflammatory, priming the immune system. We know absolutely for a fact, this isn't hypothetical, that the release of adrenaline, noradrenaline, and the stress hormones when you first go into the water is the thing that makes you feel alive, alert, that people talk about, how, it sets them up for the day. Well, that's because you've initiated a fight or flight response, because a tropical animal, which is what we are, we want to be naked in 28-degree air, going into 10-degree water, initiates a defensive response, a preparation to run away or to fight, which releases all those stress hormones. So before we talk about how long you stay in, let me just start by saying, I think probably by the time you've been in 2 minutes, you've got quite a lot of the beneficial aspects of going into cold water. Now, the longer you stay in after that, the more you start to move towards the potentially hazardous responses, assuming that you've got control of the cold shock response, you've habituated, you've made sure that it's gone away before you do anything else. The longer you stay in, now you start to get physically incapacitated, because the next tissues to cool are the superficial nerves and muscles that will impair your swimming. You can't habituate to that response. That will always be there. We see that in Arctic animals. And then after no sooner than 30 minutes in any water temperature, then hypothermia begins to be a problem. So the general advice we say is I wouldn't stay in for more than 10 minutes. And that's, I guarantee there are some experienced open water swimmers listening to this webinar who will be staying in longer than that. Fine, if you're experienced, etc., etc. But the general advice would be, certainly from a health perspective, in terms of the cold aspect, there's probably no need to stay in for more than a few minutes. In terms of exercise, maybe longer, but you could do other forms of exercise. And then all the other things about, doing it properly, having a health check, doing it with other people, doing it with the club, swimming parallel to the shore, blah, 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 blah. There's lots of commonsensical wearing, a bright orange or yellow hat, etc., etc. So, I think and one of the major issues is that the trouble is, as you become habituated, you lose your perceptual feedback of how cold you are. So that habituates to the point where you get a hypothermic adaptation to cold, and that's where you go into water, your core temperature is falling quite quickly, but you feel perfectly fine. So I would really advise people not to base the length of their immersion on how they feel. Base it on the clock. Okay. The most famous, there's a paper I wrote for the British Journal of Sports Medicine on the mystery of undetected hypothermia, which if anybody's interested in reading, I can again give them access to. And it was Jason Zerganos, 46-year-old, the champion open water swimmer in the 1950s, and tried to swim from Ireland to Scotland. And after 6 hours, he was about 3 miles from the Scottish coast. He became unconscious and blue. He was suffering from profound hypothermia. He didn't feel cold at any time during his swim because he was so habituated to the cold. He was taken from the water, and the doctor exposed his heart using a penknife and revealed ventricular fibrillation and did direct cardiac massage, which was never going to be have a good output, a good end result, I'm afraid. So that's where he died at the scene. But just be aware that you lose your perception of cold.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's following on from that answer there, Mike. I know there'll be some swimmers here who are long distance swimmers, and they'll be thinking about how can I acclimatise then? This sounds quite worrying if I'm not aware of the signs of hypothermia. And obviously, if people are going to be doing long distance, they should be doing it with a team. Maybe they'll have seen a doctor and had a medical done, and they should have a team with them if they're going to be swimming long distances, or somebody there anyway. Yep. Would you agree?
Yes, and do it incrementally. You know, always be, as you say, as a team, be supervised, do it with others, and, you know, just feel out your limits. But from a health point of view, more is not better.
Yeah, I remember you saying that the last time, actually. If, say, like, it's winter just now, obviously, and there's some people, you do hear some people saying, oh, I really want to build my time in the water, and winter really isn't the right time to be doing that. You know, for the majority of people, we won't go into the minority, but it's not the time to do it, really. So I kind of, it's really interesting that the maximum.
I mean, there's reasons why you might enjoy being in longer, because you're in a nice place and you're doing exercise. So, you know, in other forms of exercise, it's nice to do for at least 30 minutes in one go, but not when during that 30 minutes, you're, you know, getting colder and colder and getting to a point where you may become incapacitated. The other point to make about that is that cold shock response, if we're right, and if a lot of the benefits of cold water immersion come from that first couple of minutes, then it's worth knowing that the cold shock response peaks in water somewhere between 10 and 15 degrees Celsius. Yeah. So when you go into water colder than that, the sensation changes from one of cold to one of pain, because once you get down around about 5 degrees, it's cold pain receptors that fire, not cold receptors. In fact, if you go into very, very cold water, it's very hard to tell the difference between very cold water and very hot water, because essentially it's a painful experience. Yeah. But actually, in terms of potentially the beneficial effects, between 10 and 15 is the maximum cold shock response. Mm. And you can also get those beneficial effects wearing a wetsuit.
Yeah, that's good that you've said that. There was a couple of questions about that. You know, what should I do? Should I go in with a swimsuit or wetsuit to get those benefits? But yeah, I think 10 minutes, you know what you were saying, 10 minutes, a lot of us, we tend to just do 10 minutes in the winter. And when you talk about the benefits, are you meaning the mental health benefits, the well-being, the feel good?
Well, all the benefits that come from the stimulation of that cold shock response, the release of the stress hormones, the anti-inflammatory aspects of that. And for example, looking at the immune function, which is a minefield to look at in terms of looking at the markers of immune function versus, for example, the number of upper respiratory tract infections people get. And we've looked at all of this. And even there, it seems that a short period of cold will prime the immune system, may prime the immune system. A longer period of cold exposure where you start to drop your deep body temperature actually impairs it. Yeah. So less is more. Less is more.
Interesting, Mike, you say that, because I think there's been parallels drawn with exercise, isn't there? You know, a small amount of exercise can have a great effect, but too much exercise, people start to get more and more colds and stuff. We had another question kind of linked to what you were saying about, which I think is fascinating, from Maxine, and she's asking about long COVID and or like chronic fatigue, and she's asking, has there been any information or research related to the negative effect of so in relation to energy levels? So if you go into cold water, you come out, you're tired and fatigued, can that have a negative effect on things like long COVID or chronic fatigue?
No, nobody has any idea. Wearing another hat, I'm helping organize a conference through the Physiological Society in February on long COVID, and you'll struggle to actually get anyone who can tell you what long COVID is. It's very, very, I mean, it's more syndrome than anything. It's, you know, every day that goes by, there's a new theory as to what it is. It's affecting people differently. It's affecting people in terms of respiratory function, cardiac function, brain function, cognitive fog, levels of fatigue, mood, morale. It may be to do with micro thrombi, it may not. So it's a nice question, but there's absolutely nothing out there that would suggest that, other than what I've just said, is that something that is a short cold stimulus may prime the immune system. But we have to be careful about what we say, because again, I mean, it's like when we work with elite athletes, you don't make sweeping generic statements, because what's right for one elite athlete may not be for another. So what primes the immune system of a 20-year-old may overwhelm the immune system of a 70-year-old. Or it could be the other way around if the 70-year-old has been used to going into the water all their lives. So we need to be a bit careful, but yeah, less is more, and there's nothing at the moment that relates to COVID, long COVID. Other than I think there's now 1.3 million people with long COVID. And if anybody's interested in it, go onto the Physiological Society website and get involved in the conference in February.
Yeah, that's yeah, it's far too soon to be saying anything about that yet, I suppose, anyway, but it's an interesting question. And actually on the topic of immunity anyway, what you just said before that about if you stay too long, then it could have a detrimental effect on a simple case of having the common cold. You know, yes, you might be okay to go into water, but if you've got anything in your chest, then that could, you know, in effect affect your response if you've got an infection or anything. That was a question somebody had asked, that question, when is it safe to go in if you've got a cold or chest infection? So just thinking about immunity. Have you got any other questions there, Steve, that needs to come?
Got lots.
I know.
There's one, it kind of links on a little bit. Philippe has asked about the beneficial effects of cold water immersion on depression and anxiety. Is this anecdotal, or is there actually any real science to support that idea?
Okay, so we have definitely hypothetical mechanisms by which we can postulate a way by which this happens. Cold water immersion stimulates the release of adrenaline, noradrenaline, serotonin, beta endorphins. These are all things, you know, via various intermediaries that affect mood, morale, inflammatory conditions, which are supposedly involved in some depressive states. We've done studies which I've mentioned before, I think, on you know, in one of these webinars, where we took a young lady with chronic depression and you know, serious depression, and we habituated her to cold in the way that we've already discussed, with a day of short immersions. After the second immersion of 3 minutes, she was really very unhappy, and we were insisting that she stopped, but she was intent on doing it because she wanted a solution that was pharmaceutical free, drug free. So we went on and did the 6 immersions. At the end of the 6th immersion, she said it was the best she'd felt in her memory. She'd just given birth and was also suffering from some postnatal depression. And she then went off and did open water swimming with Chris Van Tullochen, who some people know from Operation Ouch and from other TV programs. And a year later, drug-free and okay. That paper has been peer reviewed. It's been written up in the British Medical Journal case reports. It's Chris Van Tullochen, myself, Heather Massey, and Mark Harper. So you know, that's a bit more than hypothetical. I mean, that's actually still descriptive with a hypothetical mechanism, but it seems to work. And anecdotally, I mean, people tend to rubbish anecdotal advice or anecdotal evidence, but it is still evidence. And as a human physiologist, it's really nice to be able to talk to your participants because they give you so much information. And I get more emails about the benefits of open cold water swimming for mental health than I do for physical health.
Sorry, Mike, that was it the program Vitamin C that you were referring to?
No, the program that I was referring to is I think it's still available on the BBC iPlayer. It was the Doctor Who Gave Up Drugs. Okay. And it was about our sort of knee-jerk response to prescribe drugs for everything, whereas some of these things probably can be dealt with by more naturalistic interventions. I mean, it links into a much bigger theory, really, is in that we've evolved to the point where we are just too comfortable. You know, we're all sitting around the globe this evening without having to do very much to stay comfortable. If you were still in the tropics, from where we evolved, you'd have a mean skin temperature of about 33. The air temperature would be about 28, and your deep body temperature would be 27. I pretty well guarantee that anybody who's sitting listening to this who says they're comfortable will have skin temperature within half a degree of 33 degrees Celsius. But you're not doing anything. So we don't, I mean, the theory is that you need to challenge the systems of the body to keep them functional. We understand this with exercise. Nobody would consider going and laying in bed for months because they'd know that when they tried to stand up at the end of it, their musculoskeletal system would have deteriorated to the point where they couldn't stand up. We use that model, incidentally, for the simulating space travel. So when we do studies in the extreme environments lab for microgravity, you basically send people to bed for a month. Students love it. They volunteer and they take to it like a duck to water. But it destroys your musculoskeletal system. It's just like going into space. Now, we could say the same about your thermoregulatory system. You know, we used to challenge it by being in a cold desert environment at night, we'd be in the heat during the day. Now we don't do that. So maybe almost unconsciously, what people are doing when they go open water, cold water swimming, is they're reintroducing that challenge to a system of the body that is necessary to be challenged in order to keep it functional and keep the body functioning.
Can I just say a quick thank you to Alex and Anne, who in the background in chat are busy sharing your papers and
thank you.
links and videos and stuff.
Oh, actually, okay, thank you. I can't afford an agent, but that sounds like I've got one. And that the thing I was just talking about, the requirement for perturbation, is also a paper that is published. You can find it if you go to the Experimental Physiology website, that journal, and just put my name in, it'll come up as one of the papers that we've published.
Yeah, we'll put a link into your ResearchGate. We'll put a link into our email there. There's a lot of questions about some of your papers, so we'll have to send that in. There's I think you've done over 600. Is that correct?
Yeah, about that. But it's quality rather than quantity that counts.
Yeah, obviously, yeah. There was a question about adaptation from David. How does the body adapt to cold? How does that happen?
Okay, so very quickly, the cold shock response adaptation is an habituation. So it's a decreased responsiveness to the same stimulus. We're pretty sure it doesn't happen at the level of the cold receptors. It happens more centrally. And the reason we believe that is because we've done studies where we've repeatedly immersed one side of the body, keeping the other side warm. And when the cold shock response habituated, we flipped the person over and did the other side, and it was still habituated. And that side had never been in the cold water. So it's occurring central. It's a central phenomenon. That paper is published in the Journal of Physiology, if anyone's interested. The response, which is the physical response to the cooling of the nerves and muscles, as I say, doesn't habituate. So, you know, you are going to get physically incapacitated as much on day one as you do on day 1,000 in terms of going into cold water, because there's no habituation to that. The habituation to long-term exposure is again an habituation. It's a decrease in the defensive mechanisms to cold. So the shivering gets reduced, and the comfort as a consequence goes up. So you're now in that situation we've mentioned where you're cooling quite quickly but feeling good about it, which is a dangerous adaptation. I mean, it's a good adaptation if you happen to be, you know, living in a cold place with not much food, because it's decreasing the amount of substrate you need to support shivering. And these studies were done way back in the 30s by Stanton Hicks and Willie O'Connor in the central Australian desert. And so for the Aborigines that were living there at the time, that was a really good adaptation. It's not so good if you're in cold water, but it's the same thing. You lose that response. So it's pretty central. And it's quite specific in that we've done studies where we've repeatedly got people to drop their core temperature by a degree, and you see their shivering response disappear, you see their comfort go up. But if you then get them to drop their deep body temperature by 2 degrees, the normal response kicks back in.
Okay, so on the subject of temperature and dropping your body temperature, obviously, you know, people will be aware of Wim Hof, and then there's, is it tumo breathing? I've heard of this, and there's a method you do, and there was some evidence that they could lower their body temperature, but increase their body temperature by 7 degrees, the Buddhist monks, and that was through a breathing technique. What do you have any opinion on this, or is there any science that you've come across with this?
Oh, I mean, there have been papers published with, for example, Wim Hof respiratory procedures. The only thing I'd like to, I mean, fine. I mean, there is definitely on the edges of the physics of cold, an area where there's some psychological component that makes a difference. We know that. We know, I mean, there is, you know, I'm just writing a paper at the moment on why it is that when the rescue services turn up to rescue someone, without touching them, their condition deteriorates. They let go. And that can be made worse if you happen to say things like, rest, relax, we've got you, you're safe. Paul Barney, when he was fighting his way out of the upturned hull of the Estonia, was doing really well until somebody in the back of the helicopter said, you're safe now, and then he passed out. Wow. So there's definitely a psychophysiological component to this. But for the vast majority of individuals, it's on the edge of what goes on. Physics predominates, you know, as Scotty said, you can't change the laws of physics. Now, the other thing about certain respiratory procedures and maneuvers is they generate heat. So if I'm there doing, you know, intense breathing or isometric breathing, I'm going to be generating heat. So the respiratory muscles will be generating heat. So, you know, there's lots of interesting aspects to this. And I'm not saying it's wrong and I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying that my major concern in a survival situation would be trying to do the right thing to get out of the survival situation rather than hoping that a respiratory maneuver might help.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking myself, you know, like for swimmers. I think that one's more for those who like to do, you know, that they're trying to improve their quality of life and doing cold water immersion dips and using breathing on land. Whereas if you're in the water, it's not going to do any good if you're swimming. Anything, Steve?
Yeah, just kind of linked to what you're talking about. Russell Henderson, hi Russell, is a very enthusiastic free diver based up in Scotland, and he's asking, you know, is there any research or any advice for prolonging breath hold in a cold water environment? Which is quite an interesting question, I think.
Yeah. Let's not get too into free diving because that's a crazy thing to do, but beautiful but crazy. But yeah, I mean, obviously you will extend your breath hold time in cold water by taking out the cold shock response. You can also extend your breath hold time by habituating the respiratory, the drive for respiratory movement that breaks your breath hold. So what people probably don't realize is that if you hold your breath now in air, the reason you break your breath hold in about a minute's time is a desire for some respiratory movement. So you can check that, because if you hold your breath for as long as you can and then just breathe out into an empty plastic bag and breathe it back in again, you can double the time you can essentially go without fresh air. So it's that build up of it's called a struggle phase of the respiratory musculature and the respiratory center in the brain trying to make you breathe. It's not because you need oxygen. It's not because you need to blow off CO2. It's simply that. And in fact, we based the emergency breathing system air pocket that was used for decades in the North Sea on the fact that if you breathe into an empty plastic bag and back, you can escape from a ditched inverted helicopter. So you can habituate the cold shock response. You can habituate the struggle phase and take out those respiratory muscle afferents that are driving you to breathe. And then you go to the point where you really do need oxygen and to get rid of CO2. And that's why it's dangerous, because if you're at depth, excuse me, if you're at depth and you've got to the point where you become hypoxic, you get the hypoxic drive to go back to the surface. By the time you decompress to the surface, you're unconscious.
Is that what you call shallow water blackout?
That's shallow water blackout, and it's compounded, of course, if you hyperventilate before you go in, because you blow off CO2, and the CO2 is is likely to bring you back to the build-up of CO2 would normally bring you back to the surface before the oxygen got too low. But if you've hyperventilated and lowered your CO2, then you're very hypoxic by the time you get to come back to the surface. And remember, 1 atmosphere in water, 1 atmosphere in air is from here to space. 1 atmosphere in water is 10 meters. So, you know, just going 10 meters, from 10 meters and under the water to the surface, you've gone from 2 atmospheres to 1 atmosphere. You've halved the pressure. You've halved the PO2.
And some of these free divers are going a lot more than 10 meters.
Yeah, and actually it's remarkable how far they're going, because if you look at the basic physiology of it, it's quite difficult, because, you know, your lung is getting smaller and smaller as you descend, and there's a theoretical limit that they're beyond where you can go.
Wow.
Yeah, it's yeah, I'd love to get into that, but that scares me. So I'm just thinking we might move on to sort of the post-swim thing. There's a couple of questions about shivering. You know, there are a lot of new swimmers here, so they're asking about the shivering when, as soon as they exit the water. Helen has asked a question: if you shiver when you get dressed, have you stayed in too long?
No, I mean, shivering is driven by skin receptors. So what normally happens, people go in and they shiver a bit and they feel uncomfortable. And after about 2 minutes in the water, because of the adaptation of those skin receptors, they actually feel okay then. And then what happens is deep body temperature starts to fall and slowly shivering goes up again. Now, when you get out, your core temperature will continue to fall. I mean, we won't get into the semantics of whether it's an after drop or a continued fall in core temperature, but it will, because whilst you're in the water, this cold front is moving into the body. And just because you take the body out of water, it doesn't stop that cold front moving in until the warm front moves in. So you will shiver, and shivering is a very good, I mean, it's a horrible thing to do. If you really want to make somebody miserable in a study, you put them in the group that has to lay under a blanket and shiver to rewarm rather than go into a hot bath. And they will never, ever forgive you for it. But because a hot bath is a really effective way of rewarming, as long as you don't over rewarm. But the shivering is just miserable. But it is an effect, it is the body's way of generating the most heat it can in the best place. So don't worry too much about shivering, other than you'll be miserable. But if you've only been in a few minutes, people talk about not having a hot shower and not having a hot bath and all this, that and the other. But if you've, I mean, if you've only been in the water 5 or 10 minutes, then it's perfectly reasonable to minimize your period of discomfort by going into a hot bath or into a shower. If you want to sit down in the shower, just in case you get a bit lightheaded, but importantly, don't overstay your welcome in these things. The bit about rewarming collapse is really when people have been in the water a long while and they are hypothermic, hypovolemic, their heart's not functioning, their blood pressure system is not functioning properly. But these are people who are pretty profoundly or moderately hypothermic. You'd be careful about rewarming them too quickly, because there's a good chance that they will have a catastrophic fall in blood pressure. But if you're a dipper and you've been in for a couple of minutes and you're coming out and feeling miserable, then rewarm yourself.
And that's because of it's basically the skin that has cooled. Your core body temperature has not really gone down, so you're going to be okay to jump into what
you're trying to do is just warm the skin up, so those cold receptors stop telling you that you're cold. But I mean, that cold front will still go in. I mean, you will see a little dip in deep body temperature, but it's not in the area where you need to worry.
Yeah.
But if you've been in, you know, a lot longer than that, and you're, you know, staggering out and, you know, pretty hypothermic, which I hope you never are, but if you were, then you'd want to be careful about certainly showering. Now we regularly in the lab cool people down to 36, 35 degrees Celsius, an hour and a half immersion, and rewarm them in a hot bath.
Yeah, and that's really good to clarify that for people, because you know there is that thing about don't go in a shower, a hot shower, you know, don't have a hot car, but it depends on how long you've been in the water. I
mean, just a quick word about the car thing, because what some people don't realize, and again, I think it's quite important if you're involved in running events, that, as I've just said, people are probably at their coldest about 10 or 15 minutes after they get out of the water, because they're going to continue to fall. If they exercise, they get a slightly bigger fall because they now send blood into the cold muscles that otherwise haven't been perfused, the ones that weren't involved in swimming, but are involved in walking. You kind of have a responsibility for those people until they've rewarmed properly. We started to do a study which got messed up by COVID, unfortunately, looking at driving capability about 15 minutes after leaving cold water, when some people would, they'd done their swim, they're now driving home. And I suspect that there's a decrement in those kind of fine motor skills and cognitive skills in some people about 15 minutes after they leave the water. So, do rewarm properly. And generally you'll know when you're rewarmed when your fingertips, you can stick them on your lip and your fingertips feel quite warm.
Yeah.
You've vasodilated again, basically.
Yeah, a good tip. I'm just, we're sort of skirting around after drop. I don't know if you want to say a little bit about after drop. There was a question, is after drop the first step towards hypothermia, or are they unrelated?
No, it's just the after drop is just a physical phenomenon of putting an object into cold. So, as I think I've said before on one of the webinars, you can create an after drop simply by taking a melon, warming it up, putting a thermometer in the middle of it, putting it into cold water, take it out of cold water, put it into hot water, and the thermometer measuring the middle of that melon will show you a continued fall in deep body or deep melon temperature, even when it's in the warm water, because that cold front has to go through before the warm front follows. Now, it's not going to be, it's not the first step to hypothermia. When you come out, you will continue to cool a bit. Not coming out is not the answer to that. You just have to come out and cool a bit and make sure that you're properly insulated so that you give your body the chance to rewarm. And that's why I was messing around with semantics early on, because some people come out and they don't actually get in a situation where they're rewarming. They actually just are continuing to cool. So that's not an after drop, that's just continued cooling. Yeah. And you see that sometimes with people who get rescued and put into boats or helicopters. You do need to give yourself plenty of insulation so that heat that you're generating can rewarm the body. But it's not a fast process. You think how much energy it takes to heat up, a couple of liters of water in your kettle. Well, most people are a bag of about 60 liters of water, and it takes a lot of heat to warm that up, and it takes a lot of heat extraction to cool it down.
Yeah.
Which is why we're much more worried about cold shock, the initial problems of an immersion, the cooling of the superficial nerves and muscles, than we are with hypothermia.
Yeah, that's where the research is, isn't it?
Just a quick question, sorry, on that, Mike. Kind of similar, but maybe the other way around. As a kid going surfing, if there was a hot shower available and I was going in for the second or third time of the day, the worst thing you can possibly do is put on a cold, wet wetsuit. So you used to jump in a nice hot shower, put the wetsuit on, and then jump in the water. And hey presto, it's found that it got very cold very quickly. Has there been anybody that's looked at putting on warm stuff before they go in a cold environment compared to putting on cold stuff? And I guess it could apply to swimming costume and things as well.
Yeah, so when we do quite a lot of work for the search and rescue organizations and Coast Guard and US Coast Guard on the estimation of survival time. And we were interested in the question of, well, what happens if somebody, we always make the assumption that somebody's normothermic before they go in the water. What happens if they've sunburned, or if they've been sunbathing? Or what happens if they've got hot because they've been playing, a game of beach volleyball or football and then go in the water? And what you find is that if you raise the body temperature and you raise the skin temperature before you go into cold water, it's just straight Newtonian. You've basically then got a bigger gradient between the skin and the core and the water than you have if you were the normal temperature. And because you've got a bigger gradient, you cool more quickly. So if you pre-warm by whatever means you want, you will cool more quickly until you go back onto exactly the same line you would have been on had you not pre-warmed. Okay. It takes a bit longer if you warm the muscles, because the heat in the muscles are kind of insulated within the body beneath the fat and the skin. Whereas when you get hot by sunbathing, all the heat's in the very superficial layers of the body and it very quickly goes. But even so, yeah, it's just you've increased the gradient, and heat flows from a high to a low temperature at a rate that is determined by the gradient.
I was thinking kind of in relation to, you know, a lot of outdoor education centres might have 2 or 3 groups of kids coming through, and you see the kids all putting the wetsuits on in the showers, and especially being quite small, maybe it's putting more risk at them getting colder sooner, I guess.
Well, yeah, I mean, the big problem with most wetsuits is people fit them for comfort rather than thermal performance. And we've all been there. And it gets embarrassing when you're trying on the 3rd wetsuit in the shop and you can't get it on because you've started sweating. And so you end up getting a bigger one because you can get that on. Whereas a wetsuit is a misnomer, really. I mean, it should be really trying to allow very little, if no, water into that space between the skin and the underside of the neoprene. If water's flushing in and out of that, and if it might feel comfortable in the shop, it's next to useless for you.
So we've just got a few minutes left. Really, as always, it just flies by. And I'm just wondering, is there anything you want to share, Mike, or is there any burning questions, Steve, that we've not covered?
There's so many questions, Norma, honestly.
We've got 4 minutes and 46 questions. I do apologise.
You mentioned before, there was a few questions about SIPE, swimming-induced pulmonary edema. Will we cover that just now, Mike, if you want to chat about that?
We can do very quickly. It's been kind of interesting in that as time has gone on, in the early days of this boom in open water swimming, lots of the questions were about how I should do it and how long I should stay in and cold acclimatization and pre and post things. But more recently, I'm getting, the 3 or 4 questions I get a week are much more to do with various medical conditions. And we've had one tonight about long COVID, and pretty much the answer to that is the same to everything. It's very difficult because there's no research being done. But there are phenomenons to do with muscular sclerosis and migraines and depression that we've touched on. But there's a whole list of medical conditions. The one I thought I would just mention a little bit about is SIPE, because that swimming-induced pulmonary edema, because people worry about that, and it is on the increase, but it's on the increase. It's still very rare, but there's just lots of people staying in the water and swimming about. So this is where you know what it is, Norma. You tell people what happened to you, and then I'll tell you some of the factors and how to avoid it.
What happened to me was I was going for a swim with friends, and I was wearing my wetsuit in the car heading to a swim, and I came across a road traffic accident, and I was first on the scene. So I attended to the casualties and phoned the ambulance, and by the time I was cleared up there, my friends had gone into the water, and so I was late. But the people were okay, by the way. So I was late, and I got to the shore, and they were swimming a wee bit out, and I waved to them, and I was rushing to get my wetsuit on. Everything was rushing. Probably adrenaline was flowing because of the RTA. And so I did splash my face. I remember that. I did the quick acclimatization, water in my wetsuit, and then followed them and swam as fast as I could to catch up with them. When I reached them, which was about 200 meters from the shore, I did start to feel like a constriction in my breathing, and I thought, oh, my wetsuit's really tight. But no matter what I did with the wetsuit, it was not changing, and my breathing was really constricted. So much so that I went on my back to try and make it better, and it didn't get any better. And I did have a moment of panic. I didn't express it, but I did have a moment, and I just said to them, I need to go back to shore. I'm not feeling right. But I didn't want to panic them. So I went back, and by the time I got to the shore, I was coughing, and when I was coughing, it was pink frothy sputum, and as a nurse, I knew that was pulmonary edema. So I did go home. I went home, and I had fluid tablets in my house, so for a condition that I was going through at the time. And so I took them to help flush out any fluid, and then phoned the doctor. And it resolved within 24 hours. So it was scary because I couldn't get my breath no matter what I did. And I did Mike's float to live, I did all that, go on my back, try and open up the lungs, and it didn't work. And I was 200 meters away from my depth. So I had to doggy paddle, and that to me was the least energy to get to shore. So that's what happened to me. So what happened then physiologically, Mike?
So,
what happened?
I mean, it's just, I mean, for people to be aware that, if you're out there and your breathing's under control, it's not in the first, this is not a first minute of immersion problem. If you're only in for a few minutes, this is not a problem. It's when you've been in a while and all of a sudden you start to feel breathless. Then that's probably a clue. I mean, you'll know if you're asthmatic and if it's an asthma type attack, but this is different. This is that breathlessness. That may be all you get, but some people get whistling and crackling in the chest, coughing, as you say, bringing out phlegm, frothy pink sputum, feeling of tightness in the chest. These are all the signs and symptoms of swimming-induced pulmonary edema or SIPE. The risk factors are if it's high blood pressure, cold water. I think also cold air is a contributor because it is a bronchoconstrictor. If you're over 40, female, wearing a tight wetsuit, if you've overhydrated, although the body is very good at getting rid of fluid when you go into the cold-induced diuresis. If you're a high level of exertion, so it's basically increasing the intrapulmonary pressure to the point where fluid starts to leak into the lung. Basically you get out and you get into an air environment, you sit upright, you loosen the wetsuit and you warm, including the air if possible. And like what happened to Norma, this will normally resolve within, quickly and gone within 24 hours. Some people may require more medical attention than that, but it's really that for the important thing for the swimmers is to understand that, if you get breathless suddenly and you get some of these symptoms, then, it's time to get out. And it's another good reason for not swimming too far out, swimming parallel to the shore, so that if you have a problem, you don't have 200 meters to go to get back to land.
Yeah, definitely. That was my learning point anyway. It was a swim I'd done many times before, but I had an unfortunate year last year.
Yes.
So on top of everything, so it's really good to share that. But my wetsuit was tight because I'd put on weight because of the treatment I'd been on. So all of these factors, but I know that some people do feel it more, or it's more experienced in longer swims, longer distance swims. So breathlessness, a tightness and a coughing, then please, when you get out of the water, make sure you go and speak to a doctor.
And the only other thing I was just going to mention before we go our separate ways was that we had quite a lot of questions to do with drowning, which, we've written lots on drowning, but I just wanted to, because people were interested in the volume of water that needed to be aspirated. I've just written a paper with Professor Hugh Montgomery, who's intensive care medic in London. And it's in the Medico-Legal Journal. We can probably put a link to it somewhere. And it's on the experience of drowning. For those people who are asking questions about what volume of water needs to be aspirated to drown and et cetera, it's all covered in that paper. And so just go on to the website of the Medico-Legal Journal. And if you look at the one, click on the tab which says highest altmetrics at the moment, the paper will come up. It's free to download and read. And if you've got any questions once you've read that, come back to me. Or we'll put somewhere on the website a link to it. But it literally is a month old, that paper, so it's got all the up-to-date information in.
That's excellent. Thank you for that link. It's just a shame that we cannot. I've been trying to pick questions as they're coming in while we're chatting at the same time. So as always, we can never get to all your questions. But I hope that you've learned something new tonight. You find it fascinating as always, and it's a really good way to spend a Friday night as well. Friday winter. So Mike, we really thank you again for giving up your time, and more importantly, this charity that you're supporting as well. The amount of money that we've raised has been phenomenal with these webinars, and that's because of everybody signing up. So we thank them as well.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Norma, for the invitation, and thank you, everyone, for your interest. And I'm sorry that we didn't address all of the questions. Maybe we'll do it again.
No, maybe we will. But do you know what I find really good, Mike, is that you are so accessible. You're the man that's writing the papers. I know you have, you know, colleagues, and you're so accessible to swimmers and cold water dippers, and we really appreciate that, because a lot of people want the evidence rather than going on Facebook.
Well, I'm looking forward to seeing the Perranporth Blue Tits tomorrow morning.
Oh.
So if you've got any more questions, I'll see you on Perranporth Beach in a howling gale and driving wind about 11 o'clock, I think.
Have you seen the forecast for tomorrow?
Yeah, I know, yeah. I'll be in the coffee pot.
Thank you very much, Matt. It's been such a pleasure again having you on. The only other thing to say is, if you're interested, we've got another webinar coming up actually at the start of February, which is with Carrie-Anne Payne. That's on the 4th of February. We'll send you a link out to that as well. There's been so many things that various people said, oh, we'll send you a link to this. We'll try and get as many of those together. So it might be that we'll send you the recording actually on Sunday or Monday, so we can gather these bits and pieces together. Unfortunately, I'm working up in Ilfracombe tomorrow, so I'll be away all day. But we'll try and gather these together and get them out to you Sunday evening, if we can do it for that.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Norma. Thank you, everybody.
Are you staying on for a wee while at all, Steve?
I'll stay on for a minute or two in case there's anything that people.
Yeah. Do you want to stop the recording just now? I just wanted to say I saw a few comments